It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the Corsair XENEON 32QHD165. As usual for a video review, what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software, depends on the processing done by YouTube, and ultimately it depends on the screen that you're viewing the video on, so it doesn't accurately represent what the monitor looks like in person. As usual, there's a full written review as well, and you can find a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Also be aware that, as usual, I do like to use a lot of in-game content, but what I'm showing you in-game, it applies more broadly. If you're just on the desktop, you're watching movies, you're browsing the internet, whatever you might be doing, the things I pick up here, they're really related to the monitor, so the colour reproduction, the contrast aspects, and some of the responsiveness aspects. You're going to be noticing these not just when you're gaming, because I do appreciate people use their monitors for a lot more than gaming. I do myself as well. This one is Corsair's first gaming monitor, in fact their first monitor. I think all of their monitors are probably going to be gaming monitors in the future because of their brand, but this is Corsair's first gaming monitor, and I have to give them props for naming it in a very appropriate way. So it's 32QHD165. You've got the screen size, which is 32 inches. You've got QHD, which is the resolution, quad high definition, or WQHD 2560 by 1440, 1440p if you prefer. And you've got 165, which is the maximum refresh rate that it supports, 165 Hz. So 32-inch screen size and the WQHD resolution. It doesn't give you the same kind of pixel density as a 27-inch screen with this resolution, of course, so it's not quite as tight, things aren't quite as crisp looking, but they're not bad in that respect. This is similar to a 24-inch Full HD screen, and that's a level which many people are very comfortable with. And you also get a good amount of desktop real estate as well. You get a good amount of multitasking potential if you prefer to look at it that way. So you can have quite a lot on the screen at the same time. And this text, whilst it doesn't look as crisp as it would at a high pixel density, and certainly compared to a much higher pixel density, such as a 32-inch UHD screen, it's still quite reasonable in that respect. And the screen size itself as well, it offers a good amount of immersion. I tend to use the screen from around 70 to 80 centimeters typically, and from that distance I did find the experience immersive but in no way overwhelming. Everyone will have their own preferences in this respect, but for me this screen size does work well at the desk. I'm now going to talk about the external features of the monitor. So in terms of its design, the main thing is this stand here, extremely solid, robust thing. It actually looks like part monitor, part military aircraft because of this stand design. It's die-cast aluminium, really solid, gives an excellent base to the monitor. It's the most solid monitor stand I've come across, certainly. And the stand neck as well, that's also die-cast aluminium. So there's a little bit of visual contrast between the stand base, which is a dark grey, and the neck, which is black. The bottom bezel is matte black plastic, reasonably slender, with a slightly shiny silver Corsair Sales logo in the middle. The top and side bezels are dual stage, so that means they have a slender panel border that's flush with the rest of the screen, and there's a slender hard plastic outer part as well. The screen surface is what I would classify as very light matte anti-glare, so this is a reasonably bright room and the screen is switched off, so you can see some what I'd call kind of glassy reflections or glassy glare. There's enough of an angle it does look almost glossy. This is just my classification system. I do talk about some of the benefits of this kind of screen surface. I didn't have any particular issues with glare, although my lighting environment's generally quite well controlled. But just be aware that because it's a very light matte anti-glare screen surface, the glare handling isn't quite as strong as some matte screen surfaces. And if you've got strong direct light striking the screen, you can get this sort of glassy quality. And you can see sort of sharper reflections than you might expect to see from a matte screen surface. This is just from a regular viewing position. With a stronger matte screen surface, it just diffuses that more heavily and it starts flooding the image, so those aren't ideal lighting conditions for any screen surface. From the side you can see that the monitor is quite thin at the slimmest point, and it bulks out centrally towards the stand attachment point. You can see the robust stand and the overall design from this angle as well. The included stand allows you to tilt the screen, you can swivel it left and right, and you can also adjust the height. The exact measurements for these are given in the written review. And I give some extra measurements such as the overall depth of the stand. You can see it is quite a large stand, although the screen actually sits a little bit further back than the front edge, which means if your desk isn't particularly deep, you can at least have the screen reasonably close to the wall. From the rear, you can see the stand attachment point. It attaches by 100 by 100mm VESA screws. You can unscrew that and use an alternative 100 by 100mm VESA compatible solution if you prefer. You can see the OSD controls towards the left side, the glossy Corsair sales logo towards the top, some ventilation holes there at the top as well. Kensington lock slot towards the bottom right. There's also a cable management system. Corsair gives this a particular name. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but I do mention it in the written review. But anyway, these are little cable tidies and you can slide them up and down the stand. There's 2 of them attached, or there was with my unit at least. And also 2 extras. And the extra ones that are included in the box are about twice as tall as this, so they're kind of about as tall as these ones together, each individual one, and you get 2 of them. So you can just unclip this, put your cables in, and then clip it back. So it's quite a neat little cable management system. Your ports face downwards. You've got a 3.5mm headphone jack, you've got 2 HDMI 2 ports, and they offer support for 2560 by 1440, the WQHD resolution at up to 144Hz. You've also got HDR support, and you've got support for adaptive sync, which includes AMD FreeSync Premium. You've got DisplayPort 1.4, and that supports up to 165Hz at the WQHD resolution. It also supports adaptive sync. You can use AMD FreeSync Premium as well as NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode. You've then got 2 USB-C ports. The first one there says Type-C DP Alt. This is the more capable port. This one offers DP Alt mode, as it says. It's also got upstream data capability, and it has 15 watts of power delivery. So not a massive amount of power delivery, but enough to sort of trickle charge your devices if you want to. There's then USB in, that's just for upstream data. That's really your main upstream port for this monitor. Then there are 2 USB 3.0 downstream ports and a DC input, a DC power input. So this monitor has an external power brick. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to explore the contrast performance of the monitor. So this monitor has an IPS type panel, more specifically an AU Optronics AHVA, Advanced Hyper Viewing Angle panel. So the IPS type panels, they're not known for strong contrast. This one is no exception in that respect, but there's still a bit of variability between different IPS type panels and how they perform. And this one's alright actually. I measured a little bit below 1000 to 1 for the static contrast under my test settings, and depending on the settings you use, you may get a little bit above 1000 to 1, but this is really quite typical and it's what's specified for the panel. Some IPS type models are a little bit lower than this, some a little bit higher. You'll also see this sort of hazing towards the corners of the screen. This is IPS glow, and this is perhaps exaggerated a bit in the video. It's very difficult to capture this accurately. Also be aware that how the IPS glow appears does depend on your viewing position. So the camera's mounted quite centrally at the moment. Typically you may be having your eyes a little bit above the central line of the screen. It is quite a large screen though, so to be fair, you may well see some of this IPS glow a bit more higher up the screen as well. But I tend to find it from a normal viewing position a little bit more noticeable towards the bottom of the screen, and you might also notice that it has a slightly different coloration depending on which section of the screen you're looking at. So it looks kind of warm towards the bottom right, a little bit cooler towards the bottom left, but generally it has quite a greyish appearance. It doesn't look strongly colourful or anything like that. The level of IPS glow on this one, it's actually quite typical for an IPS model of this kind of size. If anything, it's actually slightly lower than you'd sometimes see, so it's not bad in that respect. But also be aware that the level of IPS glow does depend on how close you're sitting to the screen. It depends on the brightness you're using for the screen. It also can vary depending on the uniformity of your unit. So my unit's not perfect when it comes to uniformity, but it's not bad for its black uniformity either. But if you've got more backlight bleed or clouding, that can bring out the IPS glow more strongly. You also have to be aware about your room lighting. So I'm sitting in a pitch black room at the moment, which always brings out the IPS glow rather strongly, and with a static contrast of around 1000 to 1, even aside from this IPS glow, you are not going to get a deep atmospheric look to things. You're not going to get an inky look to dark shades. That's simply not physically delivered with this black point or this contrast ratio. If, however, you're sitting in a brighter room, I've brightened the room up just a bit. It is not a bright room by any stretch of the imagination. It's really quite a dull day, so I'm just working with my natural lighting I've got at the moment. But you will notice that it's taken the edge off that IPS glow. I've lightened the room up a little bit more, and now on the video you'll probably be able to see some glare on the screen rather than IPS glow so much. But it certainly does help take the edge off this, and it does improve the perceived contrast quite a lot. But even so, to the eye, when you compare the what should be black or very dark shades to the black border of the monitor, you can still see, even in this somewhat brighter environment, that the black depth isn't incredible. But certainly the perceived contrast is better than when you're sitting in a very dark room. A real strength of IPS type models like this is the gamma consistency. So yes, you do get some loss of detail because of the IPS glow, but overall you get a certain consistency to the level of detail for these dark shades, which is lacking on other LCD panel types. So for example, VA, they have black crush in the middle, which masks things too much. Then further out you can actually get a bit of excess detail. With TN models, of course they're not as common these days, but you can still get some. They have this gradient of detail where perceived gamma is much higher up the screen, much lower down the screen, so things appear kind of flooded towards the bottom of the screen, excess detail. Higher up the screen, things are too blended, too masked. But on this model, the consistency is much better. Really difficult to portray this in the video. I can appreciate it might be a bit difficult to see in the video, but aside from the IPS glow, the consistency is very good across the screen for these detail levels. The brighter shades are displayed in a reasonably smooth way. There's just a little bit of what I call light misty graininess to the screen surface, but as I explored earlier, it's also a very light matte anti-glare screen surface, which means you don't get a layered appearance in front of the image or anything like that. It actually has relatively direct emission of light, and I like this quality to the screen surface. So overall, I think even sensitive users who often don't like graininess or don't like stronger screen surfaces with more layering to the image, that kind of thing, they should find this one quite agreeable. I'm now on Legom.nl, and I'm going to explore the colour consistency of the monitor. So this is the first thing I like to look at when it comes to colour reproduction. With its IPS type panel, this monitor is strong in that respect, and even amongst IPS type panels, it's actually one of the better performers. That is to say, there are worse ones at this kind of screen size that I've come across. So the Legom text test then, this appears a blended grey throughout the screen. There's a bit of a red tint to the striping of the text, but it's pretty consistent. You don't get these flashes between green and orange and saturated red as you'd see on VA or TN models. So that indicates a low viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve of the monitor. The purple block appears a pinkish purple throughout the screen. This one always appears weird on the video for whatever reason, but it's actually very consistent to the eye. It's a little bit pinker towards the extreme edges of the screen, but no extreme saturation shifts. The red block, a good rich red throughout the screen, quite a vibrant look to it. No real complaints when it comes to consistency there. The green block appears a good saturated green chartreuse throughout the screen, again nice and consistent, and this appears a good royal blue throughout the screen. I'm now on Battlefield 5, and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. So the colour consistency is at play here as well, the strong colour consistency. That means that shades maintain their richness and their saturation very well throughout the screen, rather than having some areas of the screen more saturated than others, as you get with TN or VA models. And the colour gamut on this one is very generous indeed. It has a quantum dot backlight solution, and you have to remember that most content, that includes this game running in SDR, it's designed with the sRGB colour space in mind, and if you have extension beyond that, you get extra saturation. I'll flash up a colour gamut image on the screen that shows this model compared to the sRGB reference space and also the DCI-P3 reference space. So you can see there was a lot of extension beyond sRGB, particularly for the green to blue edge and just the green region in general, and also a bit in the red region as well. So what this means is that things are displayed in a much more vibrant and saturated way than intended for this content designed with the sRGB colour space in mind. Where that's noticeable, well actually to be honest it's noticeable universally in this case because the saturation levels are so high. The sky blues there, for example, they have a real pop to them. The autumnal reds and browns, a lot of pop to them, and actually browns tend to verge too much on red as well. So this tree trunk, for example, has quite a clear red tint to it. And the sort of terracotta colours down there for the tiling as well. verges too much on red. The red icons there have a real pop to them. So things just look vibrant overall, but they also look varied, and that's because this is different to a digital saturation boost, such as increasing the saturation level in the OSD of the monitor, or using a similar kind of control in the graphics driver. What that does is it pulls shades closer to the edge of the gamut without expanding the gamut itself. So the most saturated shades are displayed in the same way, and other shades are just pulled closer to them, and you lose shade variety. But with a wide gamut, you get appropriate shade variety maintained. For the green shades as well, you won't see a lot of amazing lush vibrant greens here, but there's still enough to go on in terms of looking at the extra pop in that region of the gamut. So you've got moss here, looks too yellowish, it's kind of a yellowish green, it looks kind of almost otherworldly actually, it has a slightly neon quality to it. The same with some of the greens on this plant there, they just don't quite look as muted as they should, they just stand out a bit too much. But in the interest of balance, there are also some very lush, deep-looking greens. So these leaves here look very lush indeed. As I mentioned earlier, what you see on the video doesn't actually represent what you'd see by eye, so just be aware of that. And some people are going to really like this look. It's going to look vibrant to them. It's going to be the kind of visual excitement they like from their experience with the monitor, and that's fine. If you don't, there are some alternatives. If you set the preset to sRGB, that's an sRGB emulation setting. You can adjust brightness, which is more than you can do with some sRGB emulation settings, but you can't adjust things like the color channels or the gamma. And as I explore in the written review, I do explore this more in the written review, the balance isn't perfect by any means with this setting. Things are actually a touch undersaturated and the color channels weren't particularly brilliantly balanced on my unit, although not awful in that respect, but it does tone down the image. It makes things look more as the developers intend, and things do look more natural overall. There are alternatives to this sRGB emulation mode, and they're explored at the start of the colour reproduction section of the written review, some driver side tweaks, or some GPU level tweaks I should say, which you can employ instead. So they're worth exploring if you like to have a more muted look to things, but you don't like to restrict the controls you get on the monitor. When it comes to colour critical work, the gamut flexibility of this monitor is really good because you get very strong DCI-P3 coverage, as I showed you. You get full sRGB coverage. You also get full Adobe RGB coverage. I haven't shown you that in the video review, but it is explored in the written review, so definitely check that out if you're interested in that aspect of things. And it means if you have a colorimeter or a similar device and you're profiling the monitor, you're using color-aware applications or ICC-aware applications, it does mean you have really good flexibility with the gamut. You can work within lots of different color spaces and get good output, particularly sRGB and Adobe RGB, and decent output for DCI-P3 as well. So in that respect, the monitor does well. Also, you get your strong color consistency, so that really helps when it comes to accurate shade output. I'm back on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about the HDR performance of the monitor. This monitor has VESA DisplayHDR 400 certification. That's the lowest which VESA will certify for, so this is only a basic HDR experience. However, in some respects, actually the monitor quite comfortably exceeds that minimum specification. I'll get to that a little bit later. But when you're running the monitor under HDR, you'll see that the OSD controls are greatly restricted. It just says there, preset HDR. You can't change that. You might not be able to see in the video, but brightness, contrast, color temperature, gamma, that's all grayed out. So basically most of the picture menu is grayed out. You can adjust the sharpness, which is a nice flexibility to have. I know some people like a little bit of extra sharpness, or some people like a softer look to things, so you can adjust that if you need to. Also be aware that I'm using an NVIDIA RTX 3090 at the moment, but I have tested this using an AMD GPU, an RX 580. I've also tested it via HDMI as well as DisplayPort, and the monitor was consistent across the different GPUs and the different connections. So what I'm showing you here, what I'm talking about here, it would apply with other connections as well. It would also apply to games consoles if you're using an HDR compatible games console rather than a PC. Really, I'm talking about the limitations of the monitor itself here. An advantage of HDR is that you get 10-bit color reproduction rather than 8-bit color reproduction targeted, and that increases your nuanced shade variety. So these closely matching dark shades, there's a greater variety there. much greater nuanced shade variety, and that helps give you a natural uplift of detail. It's not the same as a gamma enhancement or anything like that you could achieve under SDR. It actually involves a greater variety of shades rather than just artificially lightening shades up, and that's something which I appreciate under HDR, even on models which don't offer a generally amazing HDR performance. And when I talk about not generally amazing HDR performance, you'll probably notice in the video that this is a predominantly darker scene, although it's really mixed light and dark. It doesn't really matter though. If I'm just showing you very dark content, the backlight stays as it would be if I was showing you much brighter content, and it stays at a level which is similar to full brightness under SDR, so that doesn't give you a very nice black depth at all. And the brighter content, meanwhile, it's quite bright, but by HDR standards, not particularly bright. What you should get, I'm just going to adjust my camera because this is a very poor representation of what things even remotely look like. What you should get is you should get the dark shades looking nice and deep. You should get the brighter shades looking really bright and standing out beautifully well. That would require, at the very least, some degree of local dimming on the backlight. Probably for this to really look its best, this kind of scene, it would really require a high degree of local dimming, or an OLED, self-emissive display. You don't get any of that here. You just got one backlight controlled as a single unit. There's no dynamic contrast element either, so that's why when I'm showing you predominantly dark shades, the backlight just stays at the same level as it would if I'm just showing you predominantly brighter content. So really, it's quite a compromised solution. There's nothing HDR-like about this monitor on the brightness side. I'm now going to dive into the water, talk a little bit more about the nice scene here, which is one of my favourite scenes still under HDR on a monitor which has a proper HDR performance. This one, again, does not. So the glint of light on the water from the sun doesn't really stand out in a particularly impressive way. The light streaming up from above doesn't either, and again the depth of those darker to medium shades isn't as good as it could be. But you do still benefit from that 10-bit colour reproduction, so you get a gentler display of gradients, more natural progressions for the brighter shades, for weather effects, and just in this case the light streaming in from above and the mist above the water and near the waterfall, that kind of thing. So that is at least nice to see. In terms of the colour reproduction, that's where this monitor does actually do rather well under HDR. It has a very generous colour gamut, which I showed you earlier. It covers 95% of the DCI-P3 colour space, but it actually extends quite a bit beyond DCI-P3 in some regions, and that's important because under HDR, the ultimate target is Rec 2020, a massive colour space. Good reproduction of the DCI-P3 colour space is considered a good near-term target, so this monitor does tick that box very well, and you get some encroachment, particularly in the green to blue region of the gamut, towards that Rec 2020 target even, so beyond DCI-P3. It just gives a nice vibrant look to elements that should look vibrant, so there's some really nice lush greens here. Lara's skin looks as it should. It doesn't look undersaturated and it doesn't look oversaturated. So under SDR, the reds are brought out too strongly, and she looks a little bit sunburnt, a little bit suntanned. And you notice that with other skin tones as well under SDR, they just tend to look a bit off. But under HDR, it's more appropriately represented because this wider gamut's actually targeted now. The same with these rocks as well. They have some good neutral browns and coppery highlights without them looking overly red. And just for a bit of variety, I'll show you another scene, again represented very nicely in terms of colour. A good array of vibrant looking greens, as well as some more muted shades. So the yellowish greens, they don't look overly yellow anymore. They don't have that kind of weird push. And there's just not a generally neon look to these foresty greens that there is under SDR, but you get some really nice lush deep greens as well, where they're supposed to be. These flowers as well, they look really nice and eye-catching, really nice eye-catching blues there. Certainly well beyond the sRGB colour space. Plenty of the shades being shown here are well beyond the sRGB colour space. But again, you see the browns of the roof and the rocks there. They don't have that red push that they do under SDR, so things are appropriately muted there, where they should be. What I would say just in general is that under HDR there is a tighter link between your luminance levels and your colour output. So under HDR, ideally you would have much greater precision. Again, you'd have local dimming at least. So with this screen and its universal dimming solution, that does eat away at some of the depth. So things don't look as deep as they should. I wouldn't say for these medium shades things look flooded. Again, there's plenty of vibrancy as I've just said, but there is a little bit of depth lacking just because of the lack of proper luminance control. So things ideally would be a bit deeper than they appear overall. But at least on the colour gamut side, it does do very well, this monitor. The fire as well, nice and vibrant, good licks of vibrancy without it looking overdone as it does under SDR. So under SDR it would have sort of oranges which verge on red and yellows which verge on orange, that kind of thing, but this has an appropriate look to it. But really the contrast isn't there. There's no real pop to those flames. The darker surroundings don't look as deep as they should. You get clear IPS glow, you can see that towards the bottom left corner in particular. It's actually exaggerated a bit on the video, but even so, to the eye, it's definitely there. So things really aren't as they should be when it comes to contrast or brightness by HDR standards, but when it comes to the colour reproduction, the monitor does pretty well. I'm back on Battlefield 5 and I'm now going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. Be aware that you will see some little interlaced lines in places on the video here. That's just moire from the camera. This isn't from the monitor itself. This monitor has a 165Hz refresh rate and I've got the game running at a solid 165 frames a second. You can see my frame rate counter towards the top right, that little green number there. And this means the monitor can output up to 2.75 times as much information as a 60Hz monitor, or indeed this monitor running at 60Hz. That has two main effects. One is that it decreases the perceived blur due to eye movement. Perceived blur is an important concept and that's explored in an article on the website all about responsiveness. There's a link to that article in the responsiveness section of the written review, as well as a little summary about this. The other advantage is that it increases the connected feel, it improves the connected feel, and that describes the precision and the fluidity when you're interacting with the game world. This is also aided by low input lag. In this case I measured just a little bit above 3 milliseconds, so there's a good low input lag, low signal delay, which is the main element of input lag you feel, so even sensitive users should find this one fine in that respect. When it comes to perceived blur, the perceived blur due to eye movement, that's closely linked to the refresh rate of the display and the frame rate of the content, but the other aspect to consider is pixel responsiveness, because weaknesses there can also introduce perceived blur. I'm now going to show you some pursuit photographs on the screen just to set the scene with this model and show you the different overdrive settings in action, the response time settings, and also show you a comparison with a few other models. With this you can see a few things. First of all, the fast mode is optimal. Certainly I consider it optimal, and that's because it gives you a very nice performance without high levels of overshoot. The fastest setting, on the other hand, introduces a lot of overshoot, and actually for some transitions it's more obvious than you can see in the pursuit photographs. The normal setting, meanwhile, that introduces more conventional trailing because the pixel responses aren't really keeping up properly with the 165Hz refresh rate. And when you consider the performance using the optimal fast response time setting, it's very similar to the VESA XB323UGP, which is a model I praised for its strong responsiveness, and it's a fair bit stronger than the Gigabyte M27Q, which is actually fast enough for most people. Most people are quite happy with that level of performance, but this Corsair, like the VESA, it just lifts itself above that Gigabyte M27Q. The weaknesses are really on the minor end. So for example, you get just a little bit of faint powdery trailing in places, for example behind the white icon there, with the medium to darker shades in the background, but that really sticks very close to the icon. It certainly isn't a smeary trailing, it's not a heavy powdery trailing, and nothing that has a major consequence to overall perceived blur. You won't really be able to see this clearly in the video because it's really too slight of a weakness for that. It sticks very close to the object, it's a lot fainter than the object itself. You can see it a little bit for some darker shades as well. It's mainly where the very bright and very dark shades are involved, but again I stress that these are minor weaknesses. Most people aren't going to notice this, they're not eye-catching, and it doesn't have a major impact on perceived blur. And again you can see just these sort of really minor weaknesses for the shadow details and the joins between the brickwork, that kind of thing, but again very much on the minor side. So the overall experience is very good at 165Hz, and there's really very little to complain about in the way of overshoot. There's a little bit of halo trailing, which means it's brighter than the background, for example around that tree trunk there. This isn't going to come across on the video most likely because it's really too faint, and if you see any obvious overshoot on the video it's probably from your own monitor rather than this one at the moment. So really overall a clean and well-tuned 165Hz performance. using the optimal fast setting. I'm on a different scene on Battlefield 5, and this one is dominated more by darker shades, plenty of high contrast transitions, good mixtures between very bright and very dark shades, and here the monitor again performs very well. There's really nothing to complain about too much. Even on the makeshift roof there are weaknesses which some IPS models will show in a reasonably obvious way, or more obvious than it is in this case certainly. Same up here as well with the dark wood against the sky in the background. Bit of powdery trailing there. Nothing substantial, nothing that really catches the eye as an obvious weakness. I've ramped up the graphics settings a bit so that my frame rate drops, and I'm now going to talk about adaptive sync. This monitor supports adaptive sync, it supports AMD FreeSync Premium, as well as NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode that can be used. I'm actually using NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode with my NVIDIA RTX 3090. I did specifically test AMD FreeSync Premium, and that's supported via HDMI as well as DisplayPort, and it worked in much the same way on all of these connections with either my AMD or NVIDIA GPU adaptive sync did. So what this does is it gets rid of tearing and stuttering by keeping the refresh rate of the display synchronized with the frame rate of the content where possible. So you'll see that my frame rate, or hopefully you can see that my frame rate is around 130, between 120 and 130 frames a second now, so I have dropped a bit. So if I had adaptive sync disabled, I'd get tearing if I had VSync disabled, or I'd get stuttering if I had VSync enabled. And to me, as someone sensitive to tearing and stuttering, I do find this quite obvious, the difference, so I really like to have adaptive sync doing its thing. In terms of the pixel response behaviour, at these kind of refresh rates, it's not massively different to 165 Hz. The pixel response requirements are slightly lower actually, so that slight powdery trailing I mentioned before, it's pretty much as good as gone now actually. There's perhaps a very, very small amount remaining in places, but it's gone from an already low amount to an even lower amount, so it's not something that most people are going to notice or should worry about at all. Overshoot levels do increase a bit, but there's nothing really eye-catching, and I've observed this not just on this scene but on various other scenes and in various other games as well. So I don't think the overshoot levels are going to be an issue for most people, even at around 120 Hz, 120 frames a second, or even a bit lower, down to perhaps around 100 Hz. I've just increased the graphics settings a little bit more to decrease my frame rate again, and the overshoot has increased a little bit. It's around 100 Hz now. So you can see it around that flag poster, I can see it. I'm not sure if this will come across on the video because even now it's not extreme. It's not extreme overshoot by any means, just a little bit more noticeable than it was at the high refresh rate. The thing to be aware of is that this is tied to the refresh rate. It's not the frame rate of the content that's causing this overshoot. I also notice a decrease in connected feel. In fact, I noticed that before when I was even at around 120, 130 frames a second. There's a decrease in connected feel and an increase in perceived blur compared to those higher frame rates. That isn't something which adaptive sync is going to help you with. It's just something a higher frame rate would help you with. I've now got the game locked at 60 frames a second. I've done that with a little frame rate limiter in the game because with my RTX 3090 it's actually very difficult to get it to run consistently at this sort of low frame rate on this scene. But the overshoot levels are more substantial now. I find it quite eye-catching now. Really, I'd say below about 80 frames a second is where more people will really start noticing this. Of course, sensitivity to overshoot does vary. It's not a one-size-fits-all in this respect, but actually if I was spending most of my time in the double digits, I'd switch over my response time setting to normal. So I'll just do that now. That gets rid of the overshoot. And this normal response time setting is not slow by any means. It is slower than the fast setting, but the pixel response requirements for optimal performance here, I know I'm at 60 Hz, but really much below 100 Hz. The normal setting is going to give you a really nice experience. You don't get the overshoot, and the pixel responses are still pretty fast, so it gives you a decent experience here. The VRR variable refresh rate range of this model is 48 to 165 Hz. The 48 Hz floor of operation actually shifts a bit. It's not always exactly the same. I found that sometimes LFC kicks in, low frame rate compensation. So what this means is that when it goes below the hardware floor of operation, the refresh rate of the monitor will stick to a multiple of the frame rate, which also gets rid of tearing and stuttering. There is a little bit of a switchover point, so there's a very slight amount of stuttering when LFC activates or deactivates, but I do stress that this is a slight amount of stuttering. It isn't the same as the kind of stuttering you'd get when you've got the technology disabled completely. It's not as obvious as that, and actually some people won't notice it even if they're quite frequently passing the boundary, but if you're sensitive to this, it can be annoying if you're frequently passing that boundary, so be aware of that. And there's also a sudden decrease in overshoot, because if your game has gone from 48 frames a second to 47 frames a second, the monitor then goes from 48 Hz to double 47, which is 94 Hz. So there's a big change in the overshoot level there. Quite a sudden change, just as you're crossing the LFC boundary there. But the hardware floor of operation, or the LFC boundary if you prefer, it's not an exact point, it's not an exact cutoff. So with my NVIDIA GPU it actually seemed to be 55 Hz rather than 48 Hz. With my AMD GPU it sometimes seemed to creep up a little bit to perhaps 53 Hz, sometimes 52, 51 Hz. It's a bit odd, to be honest. I've noticed this with other monitors before. It just depends how much your frame rate's fluctuating and what value it's come from, so it's not always going to be exactly 48 Hz that this switch occurs. But either way, it did work in much the same way, so I wouldn't stress about a few hertz here and there. The monitor also has a strobe backlight setting called MPRT, which stands for Moving Picture Response Time. MPRT is actually the measurement used to measure response times when the strobe backlight setting is active. That's explored in that little article I was talking about on the website, all about responsiveness. But anyway, MPRT is what they've called the setting. I'm not going to show you that because there's really nothing you can gauge that's useful from the video. You just see the monitor flickering. You can't see any of the advantage that this brings. But I do explore it in some detail in the written review. I look at the effect it has on the brightness levels. I look at it in the responsiveness section, I look at strobe crosstalk, and I give some subjective impressions from gameplay using this setting. And what I will say is that actually it's quite a decent setting as far as those settings go. One of the reasons for that is that the monitor is actually quite well tuned in terms of its strobe crosstalk levels, so centrally it doesn't have a huge amount of strobe crosstalk, particularly if you're running it at 120 Hz. You can't use VRR, you can't use adaptive sync at the same time as the strobe backlight setting, so that's something to be aware of. At 120 Hz in particular, but 144 Hz and 165 Hz as well, central strobe crosstalk's not awful at all. Other thing is that this has a quantum dot backlight, it doesn't have KSF phosphors. KSF phosphors, they're very common on wide gamut monitors, and they will cause red fringing because those red phosphors decay relatively slowly, slow enough so that you can see this fringing if you've got strobe backlight setting active. And fringing aside, it would also cause these colourful flashes. I do talk about these in reviews where I review wide gamut monitors, but this one didn't have that issue because it has the quantum dot backlight solution. So overall, a decent strobe backlight implementation, definitely worth checking out the written review if you're interested in that side of things. To wrap up then, definitely a premium look and feel to this monitor in my opinion, especially because of the die-cast aluminium, or aluminum for you Americans, stand. It's honestly one of the most solid bases I've come across on a monitor before, so I know that can appeal to some people. The screen size worked well in my opinion in terms of giving an immersive experience, decent amount of desktop real estate as well. The WQHD resolution, yes, it doesn't give you the tightest pixel density on a screen of this size, but it's not terrible either. It's quite usable, and it's sort of in line with the level which many people are quite comfortable with. The contrast performance, largely in line with my expectation, quite typical for an IPS panel, a bit stronger than some, a little bit weaker than others in that respect. So static contrast around 1000 to 1, a little bit above, a little bit below, depending on the settings you use. Moderate amount of IPS glow, a normal amount of IPS glow, if not a little bit lower than average, I'd say, for a screen of this size. A very light matte anti-glare screen surface, giving relatively direct emission of light from the screen. It's a quality I like to see in a monitor, so it doesn't have a clear layered appearance in front of it. And the screen surface texture was reasonably smooth as well, gave a light misty graininess rather than a more obvious smeary graininess or a heavy graininess, anything like that. The colour reproduction is definitely one of the strengths of this model. Strong colour consistency from the IPS type panel, a very generous colour gamut, fully covering Adobe RGB, with a bit of extension beyond that, 95% DCI-P3 coverage as well, so definitely good if you like vibrant colour output or you want to work within one of those colour spaces, particularly Adobe RGB, can work very nicely. The monitor does have an sRGB emulation setting with adjustable brightness, so that works to cut down the saturation levels for sRGB content. Some people will prefer that look. Naturally, it's more muted. Others would prefer the native gamut, the more vibrant look that gives instead. The monitor supports HDR, has VESA DisplayHDR 400 support, so it's a low level of HDR support. It doesn't do anything at all impressive in terms of its brightness or contrast, very much as if you've just left it at full brightness under SDR in that respect, but it does leverage 10-bit color processing, which is nice to enhance the nuanced shade variety and help it put that nice generous color gamut to good use. And that's actually useful under HDR because it's not sRGB that's targeted, it's actually Rec 2020, or at least good coverage of DCI P3, which is desirable there. So on that side of things, under HDR, this monitor does deliver a nice experience. The responsiveness was strong overall as well, low input lag, good rapid pixel response times, enough to give a really nice 165Hz experience. Adaptive sync did its thing as well to get rid of tearing and stuttering. It wasn't a true one overdrive setting experience in my opinion, because I would consider fast optimal in the triple digits and normal optimal in the double digits. Everyone will have their own sensitivities though, and I think if you want to just use either one of those settings and just stick with it, then that's probably going to work okay as well. There aren't any major issues with that. It's just that if you're a little bit picky, as I am with these kind of things, then I would consider it to be a 2-mode experience. But Adaptive Sync did work with my AMD and NVIDIA GPUs, so that was good. The monitor also has a perfectly usable and quite decent strobe backlight setting as well. I know some users like that kind of thing, so I will mention it again in the conclusion here. So overall, quite a solid monitor really, and a really good first attempt. In fact, I don't even like to call it an attempt, a really good first monitor from Corsair here for their Corsair XENEON series, which I do hope to see expanded in the future, and I'm sure it will be. Also kudos to them for actually giving it a name which makes sense, 32QHD165. It isn't a cheap monitor though. So when it comes to evaluating it and would I recommend it, that is a tricky question because the retail price, or the RRP, the MSRP, is around $800 and that puts it squarely in line with the Acer XB323UGP, which is based around the same panel but also offers a better HDR experience. It has VESA DisplayHDR 600 support and actually has quite a well-tuned algorithm for the local dimming in my opinion. So it does a lot more on the contrast and brightness side when it comes to HDR, and I actually quite enjoyed HDR on that model. And this Corsair, in comparison, it really does not deliver that kind of experience at all. So that does make it tricky to just outright recommend, but I suppose there are some advantages to the Corsair. Some might really like this super solid metal stand. There's that strobe backlight setting. The Acer didn't actually have a strobe backlight setting. The Corsair XENEON also has USB-C, and it supports FreeSync via HDMI rather than just via DisplayPort, so there are some differences there, which could sway you either way. Of course, there are some cheaper alternatives as well with this screen size and resolution, which also have IPS-type panels, but the Corsair and the Acer and others based on the AU Optronics panel, they're a bit higher end really in terms of their colour gamut coverage, so the experience is a bit different, and as someone picky about things like screen surface, I actually slightly prefer the screen surface that's used on these models as well compared to some of the cheaper alternatives, and there are also some issues with contrast being a little bit weaker on some of the other models, but I don't want to get too much into the weeds because I haven't reviewed them and I prefer to stick to comparisons of models I've actually reviewed. But I will link to a forum post where I share my thoughts about some of these other models as well. So that's really all there is to the Corsair XENEON 32QHD165. Be sure to check out the full review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.